Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. I grew up in Big Canoe, Georgia. If you've ever been there, you know it's a place where the woods seem endless, where the mountains fold into one another, and where the air in the summer feels thick and damp with pine and earth. My childhood there was made up of long summer days, rides down winding roads, and the constant presence of the forest. The trees were always there, towering, shadowing, and watching. They held beauty, but they also held a kind of weight. And for as long as I can remember, they held animals too, bears especially. We all knew the bears were around. They were part of daily life, as normal as the hills and the lake. You never forgot that they could show up, even when you thought you were safe. My sister and I had a routine every summer. The swim club was the highlight of those months. The pool felt like freedom, and the bike ride to get there was a kind of ritual. We'd ride our bikes down to the Jeep trail and from there make our way to the clubhouse. The ride was mostly downhill, which made the trip there quick and exciting. But it also meant the trip back was brutal. Long stretches of climbing, pushing, sweating under the southern sun. The bikes we rode weren't anything fancy. Just regular old Huffies, the kind you'd get at Walmart. They rattled when you rode too fast and the brakes squeaked, but they got us where we needed to go. The downhill parts were fun, but there were always a few hills mixed in, those stretches where we had no choice but to hop off and push. Leaning forward with our arms, heads down, and the heat baking on the back of our necks. Those hills always felt like the forest closed in tighter. On the downhills, the rush of speed gave you a sense of control, like you were flying. On the uphills, all you could hear was your own breathing and the crunch of gravel, and the woods felt too close, too still. We'd seen plenty of bears on those rides over the years, sometimes from a distance, sometimes way too close for comfort. They were black bears, and we'd been told they were shy, that they didn't want trouble. But when you're standing there, straddling a bike with only a few feet between you and 150 pounds of muscle, teeth, and claws, shy doesn't mean much. The memory of those encounters always stuck in the back of my mind. It taught me to listen to the woods, to pay attention. There was one day, though, one I'll never forget. A day that has stayed with me for years, and even now, thinking about it, I can feel the same tension in my chest, the same sense of something unseen moving in those trees. That morning had been like any other. My sister and I set out with towels rolled up tight and tucked under our arms, swimsuits under our shorts, and the sun already high enough to burn the back of our necks. The ride down was fast. I still remember the way the gravel popped under the tires, how the air cooled your face as you coasted down through shaded patches of road, then warmed again as the trees opened. We laughed some, but mostly we just rode, focused on the speed and the turns. It didn't take long before we reached the Jeep trail and made our way to the clubhouse. The pool was full of noise, kids screaming, lifeguards shouting reminders, splashes and echoes bouncing off the water. We swam, raced, floated, and stayed until our fingertips pruned. Hours passed, and eventually, as the shadows stretched long across the water, we knew it was time to head home. That was the part we always dreaded. The ride back was nothing like the ride down. It was slow and punishing. Every pedal felt heavier than the last. The first mile or so wasn't bad, but eventually we reached one of those hills that forced us off our bikes. I can still see it in my mind. The road angling up, trees crowding both sides, roots cutting into the earth, and the feeling of knowing you had to dig deep just to get to the top. We hopped off, like always, and started pushing. The gravel slipped under the soles of our sneakers and the sun pressed down. I remember dragging the handlebars up against my hip, one step after another. My arms already tired from the day of swimming. My sister was just ahead, her towel tied around her handlebars. The woods felt thicker on that stretch, like the air didn't move. That's when I heard it. At first it was faint, almost easy to ignore. A soft, steady sound. A crunch that wasn't ours. My sister's shoes scraped against the gravel. My bike tires bumped against the rocks. But beneath all that, I could hear something else. A slow, quiet step. Not close, but not far enough to brush off either. I remember looking to my left, into the trees. The forest was shaded there. Layers of green and brown stacked together. Pine needles and branches creating a web of shadows. I didn't see anything, but the sound didn't stop. Another step, then another. It was careful, deliberate. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. My breathing grew louder in my own ears, and I tried to slow it, thinking maybe if I was quieter, I'd know for sure what I was hearing. My sister hadn't said anything, but I could tell she heard it too. Her head tilted just slightly, and her shoulders hunched the way they did when she was nervous. The bears we'd run into before, they weren't quiet. They moved heavy, breaking branches, rustling leaves, making their presence known without meaning to. This was different. This was silence, then a step. Silence, then another. It felt like something was watching us, waiting. I kept pushing my bike, but my hands were sweating against the grips. My ears strained for every sound. The birds that had been chattering in the trees seemed to fade, one by one, until it was like the whole forest had stopped breathing. That silence was worse than the footsteps. It was like the woods themselves were listening. Then came the sound that made my chest seize up. A low noise. Not a growl, not exactly, but a sound that seemed to come from deep in the throat. Short, sharp, almost like a cough, but too heavy for that. It wasn't loud, but it carried. My legs nearly buckled under me. I knew it wasn't a bear. I'd heard enough bears in those woods to know their sounds, their grunts, their huffs. This was different. I didn't see it. Not once, but in my gut, I knew. I knew what was pacing us in those shadows. I'd heard stories before. Whispers that there were cougars, mountain lions, panthers, whatever you wanted to call them, out in those hills. People said they weren't there anymore, that they'd been driven out, but others swore they still roamed, quiet and unseen, living in the deep folds of the mountains. That day, I was sure one of them was there, stalking us as we dragged our bikes up that hill. My sister pushed harder, and so did I. The top of the hill felt like it was miles away, but we kept going. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't dare stop. Every step felt like a countdown, every crunch of gravel under my shoes answered by a softer crunch in the woods. The silence of the forest pressed so hard against me I thought I'd scream just to hear my own voice. Finally, we reached the crest. The road leveled, and just beyond it the path sloped down again, promising speed and distance between us and whatever was in those trees. Without a word, we jumped back on our bikes. My foot slipped against the pedal at first, my hands clumsy with panic, but then I pushed off hard. The bike jolted forward, the gravel spitting beneath the tires, and I rode harder than I ever had before. My sister was right there beside me, her hair flying back. Both of us silent except for the frantic sound of our wheels hitting the road. I didn't look back. Not once. I couldn't. The thought of turning my head, of maybe seeing eyes glinting in the trees or a shape breaking through the brush, froze me more than anything else. I kept my eyes forward, the clubhouse in my mind like some kind of finish line that meant safety. By the time we reached it, my chest hurt so bad I thought I'd collapse. We dropped our bikes against the side of the building and just stood there trembling, too shaken to even go inside. The sounds of the pool seemed far away, muffled against the pounding in my ears. We didn't go back to the pool the next day, or the day after that. For the rest of that week, we stayed close to home. The thought of riding that trail again made my stomach twist. Even now, years later, I can still feel it. The silence of the woods, the deliberate steps in the shadows, and that low sound that didn't belong to any bear. I never saw it, not once, but I didn't need to. Some things you just know. It's strange how certain memories just slam into your head out of nowhere, even after years of being tucked away, forgotten like they never happened. That's what this one did to me. I hadn't thought about it in well over a decade, and then last night it came back so suddenly I couldn't fall asleep. My heart was racing the same way it had back then, my mind chewing on all the little details I hadn't thought about since that night. Maybe writing it down will help, because the more I remember it, the more real it feels. And I know for sure it wasn't a dream. It was about 15 years ago. I must have been in my early teens, maybe 12 or 13. It was summer, one of those warm nights when the air feels thick and the crickets are already buzzing even before the sun is gone. Me and a bunch of friends had gathered in the yard of one of their houses. Back then, we didn't sit inside with phones or video games all night. We went out, we played manhunt, ball tag, stuff like that. We'd run around until the sweat soaked through our shirts, grass stains smeared our knees, and someone's mom would eventually flick the porch light on and tell us it was time to wrap it up. This particular night, the sun had just dropped behind the trees. That weird in-between light hung over everything, where the sky still glows blue but the ground is sinking into shadows. Out in the open field near the yard we could see pretty well, but the woods, those were already dark. Playing a game of hiding and chasing made it perfect, though. The woods gave you cover, the yard gave you open space. You had to be smart about where you ran, when you hid, and how far you pushed your luck. Me and one friend decided to climb the hill that sat just at the edge of the tree line. The top wasn't very high, but from up there you could see over the yard, across the field, and even spot the glow of porch lights from a couple houses farther away. Right at the edge of the trees was a sort of dip in the ground, almost like a shallow trench. It wasn't deep enough to stand in, but if you laid flat on your stomach, your head barely poked above the lip. Perfect cover. We slipped into it, our bodies pressed against the cool dirt. The smell of soil and damp leaves strong in our noses. We could see our friends moving through the open space below, darting around, calling out in half whispers, trying to spot us. From where we lay, it felt like we had the perfect view. I remember my chest pressed against the ground, my chin resting on folded arms, the prickly grass brushing against my face as I peered out. I could see every movement they made, and yet they had no idea we were right above them. It gave me this secret rush, like I was invisible but powerful at the same time. Then, just as I was starting to think about making a move, we heard it. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. It was so faint that I almost ignored it. But then it grew clearer. From the woods behind us, not the yard in front but directly behind where we lay, came this steady rhythmic sound. My buddy tensed up beside me. I felt his elbow nudge against mine as if he wanted to make sure I was hearing it too. It wasn't anything I could mistake for a car or a person walking. It was music. The first sound was a drum beat, low and steady, like someone pounding a hand drum. Not fast, not slow, just a constant beat, deep and hollow. The kind of sound you can feel as much as hear. Then beneath it a soft rattling, almost like rain falling through a tube. Later I realized it sounded like one of those rain sticks you sometimes see in music class or gift shops. The sound wasn't just random. It matched the rhythm of the drum, filling in the spaces between each thump with this soft cascading hiss. Layered over that came something that sounded like chanting. It wasn't clear words, just a rise and fall of voices, almost like a group singing but not quite a song. The voices blended together, carrying on the air in a way that made my skin prickle. By then, my heart was already beating fast, but then something else joined in, and that's when every hair on my body stood on end. Cutting through the drum and the rattling and the chanting came the sharp, unmistakable wail of bagpipes. There was no mistaking that sound. Anyone who has ever heard bagpipes knows what they sound like. In another setting, maybe a parade or some cultural festival, it might have sounded beautiful or ceremonial. But out there in the woods, in the growing dark, it was like a knife tearing through everything else. The pipes weren't just in the background either. They were loud, carrying, echoing off the trees, mixing with the other sounds in a way that felt impossible. The strangest part was how all of it, the drums, the rattling, the voices, the pipes, came together so perfectly, like a group of people performing. It wasn't random noise, and it didn't sound like a single person messing around. It sounded like a coordinated group, like a whole procession moving through the woods. It got louder, not gradually but quickly, like it was rushing closer. My heart started slamming in my chest. I turned my head just enough to glance at my friend, and even in the low light I could see his eyes wide open, staring. Neither of us said a word. Neither of us even breathed too loud. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound itself. The crickets had gone quiet, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My friend shifted and I realized he was about to move. Without thinking, I scrambled to my feet too. Together we bolted. We didn't bother sneaking down the hill. We ran full tilt, crashing through the brush, our sneakers slipping on the dirt. I remember my foot catching on a root and almost sending me flying head first. But I caught myself and kept going. At the bottom of the hill was a steep drop, maybe 9 or 10 feet. Normally we'd climb down carefully, but that night we just launched ourselves over, hitting the ground hard and rolling before scrambling up again. As we ran toward the yard, I saw our other friends. They weren't chasing us. They weren't even playing anymore. They were standing frozen, staring in the same direction we had come from. The second they saw us running, they took off too, sprinting toward the safety of the porch light. We didn't stop until we were all back in the yard, breathless, bent over, sweat pouring down our faces. Nobody laughed. Nobody shrugged it off like a joke. We just sat there, catching our breath, whispering to each other in low voices about what we'd heard. The rest of the night we stayed close to the house. None of us went back into the woods. The game was forgotten. Every so often one of us would glance toward the hill, half expecting the sound to start again, but it never did. Looking back now, I still don't know what to make of it. The land where we were playing wasn't far from where native tribes once lived. Drums, chanting, rattling, that could all be explained maybe. But bagpipes? That doesn't fit. That's the detail that keeps sticking with me. It's so specific, so unmistakable, that I can't brush it off as imagination. And the way all the sounds came together, growing louder and then stopping at once. Like someone flipped a switch, it just doesn't make sense. I've thought about it a lot since last night, now that the memory is fresh again. Maybe it was some kind of reenactment, or a group practicing something unusual in the woods. Maybe the sound carried from farther away, distorted by the trees and the hills. Maybe it was some weird mix of echoes or overlapping noises that tricked our ears. But I keep coming back to the fact that there were multiple of us there that night. We all heard it. We all reacted the same way. It wasn't just me, and it wasn't just my friend in the trench. Our other friends in the yard froze too, staring toward the sound before bolting. That's the part that seals it for me. It wasn't in my head. It wasn't just imagination. Whatever it was real. And that's the end of it. There's no big reveal, no explanation that ties it up neatly. Just a night 15 years ago when strange music poured out of the woods, grew louder and louder, and then vanished like it had never been there. It terrified us then, and it still unsettles me now. Even after all this time, I don't know what it was, and I probably never will. But I'll never forget it. I grew up in far southwest Virginia, where the hills roll on for miles, broken up by thick woods, old farms, and winding gravel back roads that seem to lead nowhere. If you're from there, you know how easy it is to lose yourself just riding around. Some of those back roads have been there since before my grandparents were born. Half-forgotten dirt and gravel tracks that split off the main highways and twist through hollers where only a handful of families live. Driving them at night or even in the late afternoon can feel like stepping back in time. Out there, you don't see traffic lights or big subdivisions. What you see are run-down barns leaning to one side, trailers tucked into the trees, and the occasional church sitting by itself with a gravel lot and a sign that hasn't been updated in years. It was one of those days when I had nothing better to do, and I found myself out driving with no real plan. Sometimes I just like to ride around, clear my head, and see where I ended up. It had rained the night before, so the gravel roads were damp and darker than usual, the dust pressed down by the moisture. My tires crunched and popped over the stones as I wound my way up into a part of the county I hadn't been through in a long time. The air smelled heavy with wet leaves and mud, and every now and then I'd pass a deep rut full of water where rain had pooled up. My windows were down, and the cool breeze carried the sound of the creek that snaked along not too far from the road. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got. I didn't see another car, not even a truck parked off at a house. It was just me, the gravel road, the trees closing in on both sides, and the steady noise of my tires rolling over stone. You'd think it would feel peaceful, but after a while it just felt eerie. I knew how isolated it was out there. If I broke down, it could be hours before anyone came by. Cell service was almost non-existent once you got far enough off the main roads. I wasn't too worried, but I was aware of how alone I was. As I rounded a bend, the road started to slope downhill toward the creek that cut through that part of the valley. The canopy opened up some, and I could see the sun bouncing off the water in the distance. That's when I noticed something strange up ahead. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe just some kids playing near the road. But as I slowed down, I realized it was a group of people. A big group, more than 10 of them, maybe closer to 15. They were walking right down the middle of the gravel road, headed toward the creek. What froze me in place wasn't just the fact that there were that many people in such an isolated spot. It was what they were wearing. Every single one of them had on long white robes. They weren't like Halloween costumes or anything flashy. They looked plain, almost like bed sheets or church garments. But the fact that they were all dressed the same way made my stomach drop. The robes stood out sharp against the green trees and the gray gravel, and they moved slowly in a kind of unison, like they were following some order I wasn't in on. I eased off the gas without even thinking. My tires crunched loud in the quiet, and a few of the people in robes turned their heads toward me. Even from a distance, I could feel their eyes catch mine. There wasn't any expression I could read, just a group of blank faces in the middle of nowhere, dressed in white looking right at me. My first thought was something was wrong. People don't dress like that and walk together down a back road unless there's a reason. My brain immediately jumped to the worst ideas. I thought about cults, about stories I'd heard growing up of strange groups meeting in the woods. I thought about all the times people had said not to wander too far off the main routes because you didn't always know what you might stumble into. My heart picked up, and I put the truck in reverse almost as a reflex. The gravel popped under the tires as I started backing up, keeping my eyes forward on them the whole time. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to take my eyes off of them. The group didn't stop walking. They just kept moving down the road toward the creek, but they also didn't break formation. They weren't laughing, they weren't talking, and they weren't acting surprised that I'd driven up on them. They just kept on, steady and slow, like I wasn't even there. Still, a couple of heads kept turning to watch me as I backed away. Once I had enough space, I found a spot wide enough to turn around. My hands shook as I cranked the wheel, the back end of the truck sliding a little in the gravel before it caught. I didn't wait to see what else they did. I pressed the gas and headed back the way I came, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. The white robes disappeared behind the trees as the road twisted, but the image was burned in my head. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, a dozen people in white walking to the creek. No sound, no smiles, no acknowledgement except for those eyes. My heart didn't slow down until I was back on the main road, tires hitting pavement again. I rolled up the windows and tried to breathe, telling myself it wasn't what it looked like. It had to be something else. Maybe a church group, maybe a baptism. I'd heard of people still doing creek baptisms in those parts. It wasn't as common as it used to be, but it wasn't unheard of. Still, the way it had hit me in the moment, the way my body reacted before my brain had time to figure it out, that stuck with me. Later, when I thought about it, I realized that was probably all it had been. A local church group, maybe holding a special service down by the creek. The white robes could have been baptismal gowns. The people weren't trying to scare me. They weren't coming after me. They weren't even acting aggressive. They were just walking to do whatever they had planned. But when you're out on a lonely back road, and you come up on something you don't expect, your mind doesn't take time to sort it all out. Fear fills in the blanks fast. I still think about that day sometimes, especially when I'm out driving those roads again. It makes me realize how quick isolation can turn something normal into something terrifying. Out there, where the hills block off the rest of the world and you can go miles without seeing another soul, even a harmless group of people can feel like a threat. That's the part that lingers with me. Not that I was ever in real danger, but that my mind and body told me I was, just because of the setting, just because of how out of place it looked. In the end, it probably was just a baptism, but in that moment it felt like something much darker. And that's what scared me more than anything. The way your imagination can turn strangers in white robes into something you want to escape from as fast as you can. I still remember that night like it happened yesterday. It was 2007, and I was the designated driver for my boyfriend and a few of our friends. We'd gone out, and like usual, everyone else had been drinking. I stayed stone cold sober, which was nothing new for me, but it made me the one responsible for making sure everyone got back in one piece. By the time I drove my boyfriend back to his parents' house, he was piss drunk, barely able to stand up straight. His parents weren't home, and we had the house to ourselves. Southern West Virginia has this way about it at night. The mountains fold over you like a blanket, and when the sun drops, you don't see much except black shapes against more black. The house sat up a holler, tucked at the bottom of a mountain, the way a lot of places out there are. It wasn't anything fancy, just a typical Appalachian place with a little porch out front, a swing, and about a half-acre fenced in that sloped up the hillside behind it. At night, especially with no light on, it felt like you were sitting at the bottom of an endless dark wall. I got him to bed, which was a chore in itself. He was stumbling, slurring, and I had to guide him through the house like he was a child. Once I finally dropped him on the bed and he was out, I needed a break. I wanted a cigarette to calm my nerves. I didn't bother turning any lights on. Out there, you get used to the dark, and besides, I didn't want to wake him or burn more electricity than I needed. I stepped out the back door and sat down on the porch swing. The chains creaked a little as I settled in. The air was heavy, the kind of thick mountain air that carries every little sound. I lit up, the glow from the tip of my cigarette the only real light around me. It was quiet. That Appalachian kind of quiet where the only sound is the hum of crickets and maybe a whip-poor-will calling from somewhere in the woods. The mountain loomed in front of me like a solid black wall. You can't see much once your eyes hit the tree line, just shadows that swallow anything inside. I'd only taken a couple of drags when I heard it. At first I thought it was someone yelling. Then it hit me, it wasn't yelling. It was screaming. High-pitched, sharp, and gut-deep like something being ripped apart. It sounded like a woman being murdered. There's no other way to put it. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. My first thought was that someone was out there in the woods, maybe hurt or being attacked. But almost instantly my stomach twisted because it didn't sound human the longer it went on. It was drawn out, shrieking, and almost rattled in a way a human throat couldn't keep up. It couldn't have been more than 100 feet from me, just up the fence line where the yard gave way to the thick woods. My cigarette slipped from my hand, and I didn't even think to stamp it out. I shot up off that swing so fast the chain smacked against the porch post. My hands fumbled for the door, and I yanked it open and slammed it shut behind me. Inside, I flicked on the porch light and then hit the floodlight switch for the backyard. Bright beams cut across the fence line, throwing hard white against the grass and the wood. That's when I saw it. At first, my mind couldn't even make sense of what I was seeing. It was black, big, and it was moving fast, back and forth inside the fence line like it was panicked. I stood frozen, staring through the glass of the back door. It was a cat, but not the kind you expect to see in your yard. This thing was massive, solid black from head to tail, low to the ground and pacing in long strides. Its tail was long and curled at the tip, lashing back and forth. Every few seconds, it stopped and let out this sound, half scream, half screech, that I'll never forget. It was the exact same sound I thought was a woman being murdered. Hearing it now, seeing where it was coming from, sent a cold chill through my body. The floodlight caught its eyes, and they flashed back at me like mirrors. It didn't look at me directly at first, just kept pacing, running the length of the fence like it thought it was trapped inside. That's when it clicked, when it had jumped into the fenced yard. Must not have realized it was enclosed, and now it was panicked, trying to find its way out. I just stood there, pressed against the doorframe, barely breathing. The thing was huge, bigger than any dog I'd ever seen. Its shoulders rolling like a predator, muscles rippling under its dark coat as it darted side to side. The sound it made cut through the night, echoing off the mountain, sharp and unnatural. The kind of sound that makes your gut knot because you know it means danger. For what felt like forever, I just watched. I didn't move, didn't blink, just stared as it kept running, stopping, screeching, and then running again. Finally, after a few minutes that felt like an hour, it seemed to figure it out. It crouched, muscles coiled, and in one leap it cleared the fence like it was nothing. I watched it vanish back into the mountain, swallowed by the trees and the dark, its cries fading as it went higher up the ridge. I didn't move for a long time. Even after it was gone, I just stood there, staring at the spot where it had disappeared, the floodlight buzzing overhead. Eventually, I turned off the lights, locked the door, and went back inside. My boyfriend was still passed out, snoring like nothing had happened. The rest of the night, I lay awake, every creak of the house making me jump. I kept replaying it in my head. The scream, the black shape, the way it moved like liquid shadow across the grass. I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a bear. It was a panther, a black one running loose in those hills. For years, I barely told anyone. When I did, most people looked at me like I was crazy. A few nodded and said maybe I'd seen a bobcat or a big stray dog, but they didn't understand. Bobcats don't get that big and dogs don't scream like that. The truth is, people around Appalachia have whispered about panthers for generations. Some call them mountain lions. Some swear they don't exist anymore, but there are always stories. Screams in the night, shadows moving through the woods, livestock turning up mauled. That night, I stopped thinking of them as just stories. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. That black panther was real, and for a few minutes, it was trapped in that fence. Close enough that if I'd stepped off the porch, I'd have been within striking distance, even now. When I go back to that part of West Virginia and find myself outside at night, I catch myself listening for that sound, that scream. The sound that doesn't sound like an animal or a human, but something caught in between. And every time I think about it, I see those glowing eyes flashing in the floodlight. And I remember how it ran off into the mountain, leaving me shaking on the other side of the door, knowing that not everyone gets that close and walks away untouched. I didn't tell the story for a long time, because people don't believe things they don't want to believe. But I believe it, because I was there. I grew up in the kind of place where the nights were so quiet, you could hear your own pulse if you lay still enough. The rural countryside had a way of amplifying the smallest sounds, crickets hidden in the grass, the slow shifting of tree branches in the wind, the occasional bark of a dog miles away. The air always smelled faintly of dirt and wood, and there were no streetlights to push back the dark, just the weak glow of the moon and whatever you kept burning in your own house. My property sat on the edge of a field that stretched wide before dipping into tree lines that seemed to never end. Behind my home, a gravel lane curved toward another house about 50 yards back, tucked closer to the woods. That house had been there long before mine was built, worn down and weathered but lived in, always with signs of life. A lit porch light, a car in the drive, voices carrying across the night if the windows were open. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. I couldn't say what pulled me from sleep, maybe a smell, maybe a sound, but my eyes opened sharp and clear as if something demanded my attention. At first, I lay still in bed, staring up at the dim ceiling, waiting to figure out what was wrong. Then I noticed it. A faint haze in my room. My nose picked up something harsh, bitter, and thick. Smoke. I sat up fast, heart jumping, and moved to the window. I pushed aside the curtain, and the sight made me freeze. The house behind mine, the one by the trees, was burning. Orange flames licked up the sides, curling and twisting into the night, smoke billowing skyward in heavy black clouds. The roof glowed in patches where the fire had already eaten through, and every few seconds the wood cracked so loud I could hear it even from my place. The air carried the smoke quickly. I could taste it when I opened the window wider. I got dressed in a rush, pulled on jeans, and shoved my feet into boots without tying the laces. The whole world outside felt unnaturally lit, the fire casting a glow across the field that looked wrong, flickering and uneven, as if the night itself had been cut open. I stepped into the yard, the cool grass damp beneath my boots, the smoke clawing at my throat. My chest tightened with the smell. I walked fast, almost a jog, until I was about 15 yards from the house. I didn't dare get closer. The heat radiated outward even from that distance. It washed over me like an oven door swinging open, prickling my skin, making the air hard to breathe. I stood there staring, my eyes watering from the smoke. I could see movement inside, the shadows of people, the residents of the house. They were scrambling, running in and out, trying to salvage what they could, or maybe just trying to escape. Their shouts carried faintly, but the fire was louder, a roar and a crackle that swallowed smaller sounds. It was chaotic but strangely mesmerizing. As I stood frozen there, something shifted beside me. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't sense anyone coming, but suddenly out of the corner of my eye I noticed her. A young woman had appeared just a few feet away, close enough I could have reached out and touched her if I wanted. She wore a solid white nightgown that hung loose and long, the kind of garment that looked old-fashioned, out of place. Her hair was long too, gray, not neatly brushed but loose and hanging heavy down her shoulders. I turned my head fully to look at her, my stomach tightening. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on the fire, face calm but unreadable. For a brief second, I wondered if she'd come from the house, but she looked far too composed, far too clean. Her gown wasn't smudged with ash. Her skin wasn't flushed from the heat. She just stood there, as if she belonged to the night itself. I whipped my gaze back to the burning house because I couldn't keep my eyes away from it for long, the fire demanding attention. But almost immediately I turned back to the side, needing to confirm she was really there. In that split second, she was gone. There was no sound of footsteps, no crunch of grass or gravel, nothing to suggest she had left. Just gone. Vanished, leaving only the heat of the flames and the choking smoke hanging in the air. I blinked hard, my mind scrambling for reason. Maybe my eyes had played a trick on me. Maybe the smoke and light had warped the air, created a shape where none existed. My heart pounded as I scanned the dark field behind me, the gravel lane, the open grass. Nothing moved except the fire. I'm not someone who gives much thought to ghosts or anything like that. I never had reason to. Life in the countryside is quiet, steady, built on the land and the work it demands. But standing there in the flickering glow, I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the night air. I forced myself to focus back on the house. The residents were outside now, clustered together, some shouting, some just standing still as their home collapsed in sections. The fire had taken it beyond saving. Flames chewed through the roof, sending sparks into the sky, and the windows glowed like furnaces. It was destruction happening in real time, and all I could do was watch. Minutes stretched out, heavy and slow, as the house caved in more and more. The smoke rolled thicker, spreading across the field and pushing me back a step as my throat closed from breathing it in. My eyes burned. I wanted to move closer to see if help was needed, but something in me resisted. The fire was wild and alive, unpredictable, and I was rooted there, still haunted by the image of that woman who had appeared and disappeared beside me without a trace. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe longer. The fire eventually began to weaken in sections, flames dying as the structure fell in on itself, collapsing into glowing piles of ash and timber. The roar softened, though smoke still poured upward like a pillar. Eventually, I turned and walked back across the field to my house. My boots were damp with grass, my throat raw, my eyes red from the smoke. The night had gone quiet again, aside from the distant hissing of the dying fire. I went inside, shut the door, and stood there for a long while without moving, replaying what I had seen. The house burning, the people fleeing, and the figure of the woman in white who stood beside me only for a breath of a moment before disappearing. In the days after, I asked around casually about the fire. The family lost almost everything, but no lives were taken. They said the fire had started from faulty wiring, caught quick and spread faster than they could react. Everyone had managed to get out, shaken but alive. That was the story. Simple. Real. But when I thought back to that night, I couldn't shake the image of the woman. Not because I believed she was anything other than real, but because I couldn't explain her. I had seen her as clear as I saw the flames. Every detail of her gown and her hair burned into my mind. And yet she had left no trace, no sound, no presence beyond that fleeting moment. I began to wonder if she had been a neighbor I didn't know about, someone drawn by the fire just like I was. Maybe she stepped away faster than I realized, blending into the dark before my eyes caught up. Maybe the smoke played tricks on me, making me think she was closer than she was. The mind does strange things under stress, and the fire had been nothing if not stressful. That's the explanation I hold to. Nothing supernatural, nothing unexplainable. Just a moment of confusion on a night when chaos unfolded right in front of me. But still, even now, years later, when I walk across that field and look toward where that house once stood, I remember standing there with the fire burning so hot I could feel it on my skin. I remember the smoke choking the air, the sounds of wood snapping, the cries of the family. And I remember the woman in white, close enough to touch, silent and still, gone the second I looked away. It was real. I know it was real. I just don't know what part of it belonged to the world I understand, and what part of it belonged to the tricks of light and smoke. But I'll never forget it. I was driving back to Franklin County, Pennsylvania from South Bend, Indiana for winter break. I'd done the trip enough times before to know the routes, and I usually tried to avoid the turnpike whenever I could. The turnpike was faster, sure, but there was something I liked about the back roads. They were quieter, less crowded, and I could just sort of fall into the rhythm of driving. It felt more personal, like I was making the trip my own instead of being herded along a toll road with everyone else. That night, though, I probably should have just stuck to the highway. It was mid-December, well after sunset, and I knew full well what Blue Mountain could be like in the dark. Route 641 winds back and forth over the ridge, with long grades and sharp switchbacks that feel unforgiving even in the daylight. Locals know not to push their luck on that stretch, especially once the frost sets in. But I figured I'd be fine. I had driven it before and nothing had ever happened. I just wanted to get home, and I liked the idea of sticking to the way I always went. The cold had been biting all day. Even with the heat going in the car, I could feel it pressing in, the kind of deep December chill that makes the air taste metallic. There wasn't any snow on the road, thankfully, but patches of old ice lined the shoulders, and the trees on either side looked heavy and stiff, branches weighed down from days of frost. The mountain felt like it was holding its breath, dark and quiet, except for my headlights cutting across the turns. When I reached the top, I slowed down for the first big hairpin. The road there bends hard, almost doubling back on itself, with a steep drop on one side and a rock wall on the other. My tires crunched slightly on loose gravel as I steered through it, eyes locked on the beam of light ahead. That was when it happened. As soon as I started the descent, just past that highest curve, a man was standing on the shoulder. 1 second the road was empty, and the next there he was, lit up by my headlights. I don't know where he came from, He wasn't walking up from the guardrail or stepping out of the woods. He was just there, as if he'd materialized from the dark. I jerked the wheel hard to the left to avoid him. My back tire skidded for a split second, and the guardrail loomed way too close to the drop, but I managed to keep control. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it was in my throat. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I straightened out. The man was still there, standing in the cold, facing the road, looking straight at me. That look, it froze me worse than the near accident. His face wasn't panicked, like you'd expect if someone almost got clipped by a car. It wasn't even startled. It was blank, calm in a way that made no sense for the situation. The glare of my headlights washed out the details, but I could make out enough to know he was just standing there, still, watching me as I sped away down the mountain. The whole thing lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it didn't feel real. My mind kept scrambling to explain it. What was he doing there? Why was he on that stretch of road in the middle of the night, in the middle of December? That wasn't a place where people walked. There weren't sidewalks. There weren't houses close by. There was no shoulder to speak of. Just a thin strip of dirt and gravel pressed up against the mountain or the drop. And the cold was brutal. The kind of cold that keeps most people inside. I drove faster than I should have down the grade, trying to put distance between myself and whatever I had just seen. Every hairpin after that felt sharper, every shadow darker. My hands gripped the wheel until my knuckles ached, and I couldn't stop flicking my eyes to the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights behind me, or that figure somehow following me along the road. By the time I got to the base of the mountain, my chest was tight and my throat was dry. I slowed down, trying to steady myself, but the image of the man wouldn't leave me. The way he stood there, the way he looked right at me, burned into my brain like an afterimage from staring into a light too long. I kept replaying it in my head as I drove on through the valleys. There were explanations, sure. Maybe he was a hunter heading back late, or maybe a stranded motorist walking to find help. But even as I told myself that, none of it lined up. He hadn't been carrying anything. No flashlight, no bag, no gun, nothing. Just a man standing by the road in the dark, on one of the coldest nights of the year. And why stand there? Why not wave me down if he needed help? Why not move if a car was barreling straight at him? That still unsettled me the most. He hadn't even flinched when I swerved. He just stared. The drive felt longer after that. Every set of headlights I passed made me tense up. Every curve felt tighter than it should have. When I finally rolled into Franklin County, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The roads flattened out, the houses became more familiar, and the weight of the mountain slowly lifted. I pulled into my parents' driveway later than I had planned, the car ticking as it cooled in the cold air. The warmth of home should have been comforting, but my head was still back on that mountain. I kept seeing the man, replaying the moment in my head, the blank stare, the stillness, the way he didn't belong there. Even now, I don't know what the hell that was. Maybe he was just some guy, and I happened to cross paths with him at the worst possible place and time. Maybe there was a reason he was there that I'll never know. But I'll tell you this, I don't take that road at night anymore. Not because of the turns, not because of the risk of ice. Because of him. Because once you've seen something like that, you can't unsee it. You can't drive those curves without wondering who or what you might find standing on the shoulder again. It was one of the strangest, most unsettling moments of my life. Nothing supernatural, no ghost story. Just a real man in a place he shouldn't have been, at a time no one should have been there. And that's what makes it worse. Ghosts don't scare me. People do. The light on Big Frog Mountain was the kind of light that made everything look older than it was. It was the late kind of dusk when the sky went soft and the trees turned into dark shapes, when shadows lengthened and the world lost its sharp edges. Miles of nothing separated us from the nearest house, and the road up there was the kind that ate headlights and spat out silence. I remember the way the air felt cool and thin, like it had been hand-polished. I remember the smell of wet earth and pine, and the faint metallic tang that comes with the kind of silence you get in places where people do not go much anymore. We had been out there because being out there felt like the best kind of escape. It was one of those teenage choices that felt brave in the moment. A small rebellion with no real consequences. The girl with me liked the mountain. I liked her. The dusk made everything seem private and ready for things that felt important, but were small in the long run. We parked near the trailhead by the old turnout, the place where the ground turned to packed dirt, and then to roots and stones that led up into the trees. Behind the car was a bit of scrub, and a shallow depression in the ground that filled with water whenever there had been a rain. The puddle glimmered in the last daylight like something that had been left out by accident. I stepped into that puddle, because I did not see it until I stepped. The water felt colder than the air, and the ground squished under my shoe. The color of the water was off. It was light brown, but not the kind of brown that comes from ordinary mud. It had a kind of faded tea color, like old coffee mixed with pale clay. I thought about it for a second because odd colors matter in the brain when nothing else does. I pointed it out to her because that is what you do when you are with someone and feel like sharing the small oddnesses that make you feel. Noticed? We started up the trail because the idea of a walk before it got fully dark felt right. The trail ran in and out of the trees and bent around rocks. There were drops in the slope where the path disappeared for a moment, and the light made the trees look like a wall of black. Not far up, she stopped walking. She had that look that people get when something small becomes a seed of worry in their heads. Her pace slowed. She turned back toward the car, and I followed because leaving felt safer, and because I did not want to press whatever it was that made her uneasy. Back at the car, the air inside had that warm, used smell of leather and sweat and perfume. We sat in the front seat because it felt private enough with the doors closed. The engine was off. We lay back and kissed, because that is what people do in cars at night on mountain roads. Her hand was out the window, the kind of careless gesture that feels intimate and free, hanging with fingers drifting through the cooling air. The world outside was a soft blur. Somewhere down the road, a faraway insect or night bird made a sound that was swallowed by the trees. There are times when the body remembers patterns before the mind does. My back went cold the first time. It was a tiny prickling across the skin, the same feeling I had once when someone came up behind me in a crowded hallway. It was the kind of attention that announces itself as something pressing at the boundary of your space. I told her to pull her hand in because it felt prying and wrong to have a hand out in a place where anyone could reach it. She did, and we went back to what we were doing. The dark wrapped around the car like a blanket. I am not the kind of person who usually notices things like breathing. That night, the back prickling came again, a little worse. This time, there was a sense of urgency to it. It was like when a dog puts its head on the back of a couch and waits for you to look over. It sent a little rush of adrenaline through me that sharpened my senses. The window was up and the car was quiet. I could hear the small noises of leaves and the distant twist of the road like a far-off train. My stomach went tight. I rolled the window up out of habit, and not because I thought anything would change. Being a horny teenager does odd things to the part of the brain that values caution over pleasure. I let it slide and went back to kissing. Then the shock came like a cut through the skin. It felt like someone had put a live wire to my back. The sensation was sudden and absolute. Pain did not start it. It was more like a violent pressure that filled the space between my shoulder blades and froze me. My head snapped up and my muscles contracted the way they do when you step off something, and your brain says there is no ground. The car was alive with a feeling I had only felt before in moments when a person was directly behind me, breathing or touching the fabric of my clothes. I started the car without thinking and pushed the gear into drive. The engine's burble was a mindless grounding noise. Drive out of here was the only thing my hands knew to do. She was confused because confusion comes when the world rearranges itself without explanation. I told her I did not know, only that something was wrong. That was the truth, and the worst kind of truth because it gave no anchor. We got down the mountain in a hurry that was clumsy and jagged. The road tightened and loosened, and I kept one eye on the rearview mirror because adrenaline makes the mind watch for threats. I remember how the car felt like a small, private thing moving through a landscape that was indifferent and huge. The trees seemed to lean in and watch as we passed. By the time we reached my parents' place, the night had deepened into something close and soft. My parents were there in that ordinary, terrible way parents are when children return home from something risky. They checked the house and the cars because that is what parents do. The family was fine, which was supposed to be a relief. The kitchen smelled like reheated dinner. We ate because we needed to make the world return to human pattern, to speak with action in the form of forks and plates. After a while, we started to leave. I can explain the way my mind moved then as an attempt to take back the story, to make the evening be something ordinary rather than a bruise you could not see. I opened the car door for her and walked around to the back because the muscle memory of shows and movies made me think of the grand gesture of checking the car over. There was a different reason too, a small nagging worry I could not name. When I turned and glanced at the back of the car, the world folded in on itself for a second. The light on the driveway from the porch lamp made the paint look cheap and gray. Across the trunk, smeared on the metal like someone had used the car as a canvas, were handprints. They were the same pale, light brown as the puddle back at the trailhead. There were several of them. The prints made a line from the rear of the car toward the top, and the last clear print was high over the back window, as if the person had been inching forward on the surface. The sight hit me like a bolt. I felt something electric tear through my chest, something that left me hollow and shaking. It was as if the knowledge of what had been happening slotted into place. The tiny prickling that had been only a sensation became a story in my head. Someone had been at the back of the car when we were by the trail. Someone had put their hands on the car and climbed or wormed forward, leaving those prints as a map of their movement. The realization made the skin on my arms lift. I got her out of the car. She saw the prints at the same time I did. The way her shoulders dropped and the quick intake of breath that was silent made me understand that she connected the dots too. There were more marks along the roof, faint but there, a trail of brown leading forward toward the driver's side where the front window met the door. It was not the random smear of a hand grown impatient. It was careful, as if someone was using the car as a ladder, using the roof to move quietly from the back to the front. My heart beat loud and stupid in my chest. I put my hands on the trunk where the prints were, and pressed so hard I could feel the places where the paint dips. The texture of the mud left a powdery smear on my fingers. It smelled like the puddle at the trailhead, like damp clay and old water, like places that do not dry easily. There were scuffs near the edges where shoes had hooked and pulled at the paint. My boots crunched on the gravel. The driveway light drew a halo of clear detail in the darkness. The world felt too small and too big at once. There was nothing else obvious. No footsteps beyond the vague shape of prints in the mud near the curb. No sign that the person had forced a door or broken a window. It was as if they had ridden the surface of the car forward and then dropped off at some point and melted back into the night. The idea that someone had been that close and that we had not noticed while we were in the front seat flicked along my spine like an insect. I called the police because calling the police is what you do when something that did not make sense has happened. I left the phone in my hand and did nothing else while I waited. I remember the sound of the porch light humming and the neighbor's dog barking in the distance. Ordinary noise pressed up against an extraordinary thing. The operator's voice was professional and soft in the way voices are when they mean to soothe. She asked the routine questions that probe for facts. I answered where I could without telling the story in the sharp, jagged way that it felt in my head. Saying the normal facts out loud made them less like a shape and more like a list. A hill, a trail, a puddle, a car, handprints, the feeling in my back. The facts settled like stones. The officers who came were calm in the way people are when they are trained to be calm. They walked the property and looked closely at the car. They used lights that made everything else look undead and gray. They took photographs of the prints because photographs make records of things that might otherwise be forgotten. They photographed the line of handprints on the roof, the scuffs on the trunk, the smear of muddy powder that my fingertips had left when I touched the paint. They moved around the car in a way that was methodical and slow, looking for tiny turned leaves or a broken branch that would mark the path someone had taken. They asked for my account and wrote it down. They asked what time we had been on the mountain and what time we had returned. They looked at the trajectory of the prints and at the faint marks on the gravel that might have been a shoe or might have been a trick of the light. One of them put on gloves and ran a forensic brush along the area where the prints seemed freshest, as if the surface would yield prints that would identify a person. They told me later that sometimes prints on a car can be partial, and sometimes not unique enough to match. I could feel my mouth go dry. The rustle of their papers was a small, present sound in that vast quiet. They asked whether anything had been taken from the car. Nothing had. The doors were locked when we had left. No one had tried to get in. The officers speculated, in the flat way of people trained to conjecture without panicking, that whoever had touched the car might have been moving along the outside, perhaps trying to peer in, perhaps trying to get a sense of whether anyone was inside. They offered me the option of staying the night at the station or calling a friend. Neither choice felt like any kind of true safety. They took my statement and collected what they could. They suggested I leave the car where it was, and they would send someone to dust it for prints in the morning. They also suggested that we find a lit, populated place to stay the night. We did not want to stay at someone else's house. The comfort of home felt necessary. I was angry at myself for taking us into that situation, for letting laziness override care. The thing that bothered me more than anything else was the idea of being watched. Not the raw possibility of danger, but the idea that someone had been close enough to our private moment to make their presence matter, to press their hands against the place where we had been touching. That thought buzzed in my ears like a bad station. When the officers left, they told us they would be in the area, and to call if anything else showed up. I sat in the car with her in the driveway and watched the patterns of light through the trees. I kept thinking that I should have felt a heavier weight, a body on the back of the seat, something physical to explain that live wire jolt. But the sensations we get are not always literal expectations of physical proof. Sometimes the body reacts because the brain catches something otherwise missed. The angle of a shadow, the tiny movement of leaf tips, the smell of mud in the air. Our bodies are built to notice the hints of danger, and sometimes they are right. I tried to remember detail after detail about the mountain. The puddle was light brown. The trail had been empty. There had been no footsteps at the trailhead to suggest someone else had been leaving, or coming as we did. But you cannot rely on memory when it is clouded by the kind of fear that eats away at clarity. 30 minutes gave me the shape of the evening, and then memory blurred. The officers' flashlights found nothing else. The photographs would prove what they proved, that there had been prints on the car that matched the mud in color and texture with a frightening accuracy. What followed was a sequence of things that looked like what happens after an ordinary crime. I stayed away from the mountain for a long time. I drove on roads with windows up. I slept with the lights on for nights that blurred into weeks. I took to double-checking the trunk and the back seat before walking away. The memory became a list of measures, a ritual I performed to feel safer. We were careful in ways I had not been before. We told fewer people about where we were going. The mountain, once a place that made us feel distant and small in a good way, became a spot to avoid because the idea of that quiet held something predatory under its skin. Months later, I drove by that turnout alone to see if there was anything else left. The place looked the same. Trees did not change much over a season. The puddle was gone, filled in by a dry summer. The ground where the puddle had been was cracked and pale. The turnout had an old, abandoned feeling, and when I stood in that place, the memory slotted itself back into the present. I walked around the area and looked for footprints or scuffs that might tell me where someone had lain in the grass or crouched under the brush. There was nothing. The ground outside the car did not give me the shape I wanted. The car's handprints had been muddy enough to be unique in the moment, but not durable enough to lead me to a person. The officers had said to check cameras along the road, and to speak with anyone who had been on the mountain. There were no cameras. There were no houses with porches that looked down on that turnout. The honest truth was that this was a place where somebody could be and then be gone. It was a place that offered the cubic space for someone to hide, and then, by the geometry of a car and a road, to edge along a surface until the light and the chance and the attention of a couple inside made them come forward. At night I would trace the prints in my head. The line along the roof became a motion in my imagination. A person low to the ground moving forward, placing hands, using the contour of the trunk as a step, the roof as a bare ladder. They would plant a foot at the bumper once, then another near the side seam, then spread weight to reach the rear window and drag a hand forward. It was a methodical movement that implied patience and care. It had a kind of cruel deliberateness. I thought about motives because thinking about motives is a way we try to tame fear. The simplest explanation that made sense to me without invoking something fantastical was that the person wanted to get into the car or wanted to see inside. Perhaps they were a local who watched the turnout and observed cars. Perhaps they were some kind of predator who enjoyed the slow creep of closeness. Perhaps they were a drifter high on something with a fragile attention span who had decided in a flash to climb along a car. Any of those were possible, and none of them comforted me. There were practical things that mattered. A person who climbed across a car leaves other things behind. Mud on shoes leaves a trail. Twigs bend and snap. A jacket might be caught on a branch. The investigators looked for all of those. They combed the roadside. They traced the line from the road to the turnout. They searched the ditch and the brush for signs. They followed a faint chain of broken grass and a bent fern that might have been made by a person stepping. The track evaporated into the tree line. The deeper down the path they went, the less confident they were in claiming anything definite. It is difficult to prove movement in a place that is meant to have motion from wind and animals. The forest is full of other lives. The police told us that sometimes the person reappears somewhere else in a pattern. They asked if we had any idea who it might be. We had none. They suggested checking for previous reports of similar behavior in the area. That felt like a small hope. If the person had done something like this before, maybe there would be a file, a name, a face. But there was nothing on record that connected a person to what had happened to us. That left a vacuum that did not make sense and could not be filled. Time went on. The prints on the car remained like a scar. When the paint was washed, the marks faded. The powdery mud buffed out under soap and elbow grease. But the memory did not wash away because memories are not physical marks. They are the way we hold knowledge in our bodies. The shape of that night lived in a muscle and a reflex and a lightness in my stomach whenever I thought of quiet places. I learned to live around the memory. I resumed going out sometimes. I learned that not every dark place hides something dangerous, and that not every strange feeling means imminent threat. Those are lessons of stubborn survival, lessons you have to relearn or you stop living. But I also kept a small reserve of caution that did not let go. I checked the back seat before I unlocked a car. I parked under lights if I could. I walked the edges of unfamiliar paths. I became the person who notices odd puddles in their color. Years later, something else happened that pulled the night back into sharpness. A story on the local radio spoke of a man found sleeping in the brush near a different turnout up the mountain range. He had mud on his clothes and on his hands and a strange collection of small things with him. The items were the kind of detritus people leave behind. A lighter, a battered water bottle, a cheap pocket knife. The station mentioned that he had been seen moving between cars at odd hours, that local residents had reported personal items missing, or small things taken from open vehicles. The story did not connect him to our case because there was no way to make a definitive link, but the pattern was close enough to the bone that I felt a familiar tightening behind the sternum. The man had been arrested later that week for trespassing and for small thefts. He was a drifter with a history of petty crimes in the county. Some people called him a menace. Some called him a problem that the law could handle. There were stories about how he slept in the brush. and how he had once been a soldier who could not quite hold a life together. The news did not tell us whether he had climbed over cars, or whether he had been the person who had watched us on Big Frog Mountain. The police never called to say they had found a match. Perhaps the prints on the car would never be traced to a single hand and a single face. That was a possibility that settled in like dust. Even without firm answers, knowing there was someone arrested for similar actions was a small relief. It offered a shape, even if a jagged one, to the terror. I imagined him as the maker of the prints because imagining specifics is a better balm than imagining the vast, faceless possibility of menace. My imagination supplied the missing pieces enough to let me sleep. The girl and I did not stay together. Life did the ordinary work of pulling people apart. The mountain remained as a place we both had known, but the practicalities of living took us elsewhere. I wondered later whether she had nightmares for a long time, or whether she dismissed the event with the forgetfulness of youth. I had always wanted to tell her more, to say that the prints were not an accident, that the live wire feeling had been a warning we had ignored. But I did not want to put a trauma on her again, so I kept the story like a stone in my pocket. People asked me why I remember it so clearly, when there were other nights and other things. The answer is simple. Those moments where someone else's attention touches you, and you might not know their face, are the ones that teach you about the edges of safety. They are the moments that make you revise how the world is arranged. You stop taking distance as a given. You learn that the places you thought were private are porous in ways you could not see at first. That is not a fanciful thing. It is the truth of the world when you live inside the flesh and the fear. I kept the little rituals. I checked the tire tracks near where we had been parked. I learned how to move so that I would be less likely to be simply watched. Not by design or by paranoia, but by the slow accretion of caution. The prints on the car taught me to respect the quiet as something that hides more than trees. That lesson was practical and real. I did not like to tell the story in bars or to laugh about it as if it had been a small adventure. It did not feel like humor. It felt like a thing that had touched the nerve endings of my life and left a mark. Taught me that a touch can be a claim, and that people make claims in ways that are not visible, until the smear of their hand becomes something the light will not erase. When I think about that night now, I do not see ghosts or melodrama. I see a person somewhere out there who chose to cross the line between public and private, and to press a hand into a place that belonged in that moment to us. I see the smallness of our choices. A walk up a trail, a casual hand out the window, the choice to roll the glass up or not. Those small things made a path for a stranger to step into our private space. The ending is not cinematic. There was no dramatic chase or rescue under floodlights. There was no grand confrontation with a face to remember. The ending was a series of small decisions that together made a final shape. We left the mountain and returned to the ordinary shape of days. We called the police and gave statements. The officers photographed the prints and took samples of the mud and asked us to be careful. They searched and found nothing conclusive. The marks on the car faded after a wash. Time softened the details. But there was an ending that mattered, and that was clear in its own way. The ending was the way I changed because of that night. I stopped pretending that the quiet places belonged to me without looking. I stopped assuming that proximity is harmless. I kept a vigilance that was not paranoia but a careful awareness. I never went back to that turnout in the same way. The mountain remained, but it stopped being a place of secret delights and became a place I viewed with respect. I told no one the whole story, rarely, and only when someone's eyes were steady, and when there was space for the truth without the need for a neat resolution. And in the quiet that followed, I made other changes that were sensible and final. I began to park where there were lights. I began to walk with a flashlight when I needed to be in odd places. I started telling people where I was going when I went somewhere alone and to check in when I arrived. I learned to treat small instincts like the prickling at the base of my spine as real warnings, rather than something embarrassing to ignore. Those changes kept me safe in ways the police photographs could not. Months blurred into years. I washed the car until the handprints were gone from the metal. I put the memory away like a map I carry folded in a pocket, something I can unfold if needed, but that does not take up the whole of my life. Occasionally, the smell of damp clay catches at me when rain wets a road, and the mind goes to that shade of light brown and the roof of a car glinting in a driveway light. I allow the shiver and then I let it pass. I do not believe in ghosts. I do believe in human hands and in the choices people make. The story ends because I learned from it, and because I did what was necessary to keep living. I filed the report. I changed my habits. I told myself not to be reckless with the small things that invite presence. That is the clearest ending I can give. A life adjusted. A mountain remembered as a place that taught me something about vigilance, and a pair of hands on a car that left a mark I would never forget.